Hi everyone, I hope that you are all doing fine. Let's start the next lecture of your Theories of Culture course. It is going to be the second half of the topic Post-structuralism, and the theoretician that we are about to familiarize ourselves with is Jacques Derrida. So this slide has this web design as a background picture for a reason. It's supposed to represent a structure, and if you look at it closely, you see that it doesn't really seem to have a center, right? That is going to be very important later, but now let's start at the beginning. So Jacques Derrida, whom you can see on this picture, was a French philosopher whose name is basically synonymous with the word deconstruction. Now, what is deconstruction? I hate to say it, but this is where our problem starts if we are not conscientious enough. Deconstruction, importantly, is not a theory of something. It is often described as a method of analysis, a type of critique, an act of reading, a way of writing, but essentially it is a way of conceptualizing things, a way of thinking, if you like. The text that we are going to discuss in detail is titled Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. It was originally a presentation at a very important landmark conference that was titled The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man at Johns Hopkins University in 1966. Now, this event itself was supposed to be the celebration of the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. His name may be familiar. He's one of the greatest thinkers of structuralism. And he was there at the conference, actually. And Derrida's talk and his project altogether was, or turned out to be, more of a criticism of Lévi-Strauss rather than a celebration of what he achieved, and actually turned into this big historical moment, at least in academic circles, because it seems to have triggered this change in academic thinking that resulted in structuralism being replaced with post-structuralism, basically, although the emergence of post-structuralism cannot really be tied to one event or one text or one theoretician even. But we can say that Derrida's talk at this conference was very, very influential, probably much more influential than he intended it to be or he hoped it would be. Now, if you look at the title, Structure, Sign and Play, maybe it doesn't seem to say much, but it implies the topic or the topics. Structuralism, now the word structure implies structuralism, of course, especially the idea of this positivist way of thinking that comes with structuralism. When you see the word sign, you probably think of semiotics, especially Saussure's idea of the sign. And finally, play sort of refers to the nature of deconstruction itself. It may not seem very playful at first, but playing and playfulness are actually good keywords. Not the only keywords, but they are among the good ones if you want to describe post-structuralist thinking in general. So two things that I think should be repeated before discussing Derrida's text are Saussure and structuralism. Saussure, we talked about him. As we know, he was the first linguist who started to think about language as a system instead of a bunch of names for things, to put it very simply. Maybe you remember that in his course, he states this repeatedly, that a sign is not just a name for a thing. He keeps saying this, of course, because this was the assumption about language before he developed his theory of the sign. Now, when it comes to his theory of the sign, you probably remember that he claimed that there is no relationship between the signifier and the signified, the two components of the sign, and nothing really holds them together except for the knowledge of the language user community. If the community decided to associate a signified with another signifier, it would work just the same. And what's even more important for us is the way we use signs, the way we know and understand them. We see a sign and we know what it means, because we know that it doesn't mean anything else, and nothing else means exactly what this one does. This is the logic basically behind our knowledge of science, and Derrida is going to build a lot on this. Now, on the other hand, we have structuralism. Saussure and structuralism are not really two distinct things and not really comparable either, but Saussure is a structuralist linguist and structuralism is an intellectual movement or a method of the humanities, to define it very broadly. But altogether, structuralism largely grew out of Saussure's theory of language. At the time of the conference where Derrida presented his famous paper, Structure, Sign and Play, it was the heyday of structuralism. It was 1966 and structuralism was popular in the 1960s and 70s. And structuralism was this huge movement overarching numerous fields and numerous thinkers. In this course, we haven't discussed structuralism earlier, but you probably heard of it in different courses or other courses. So it is the work of lots and lots of very different thinkers, but what they all had in common was the understanding of phenomena, things, whatever they happened to be investigating, words, narratives, myths, traditions, social practices. So the understanding of these things not as discrete entities in and of themselves, but as parts of larger structures or systems. The emphasis is on making sense of things as signs in larger sign systems, and on perceiving the ways in which one sign system relates to another. Here you can probably sense the influence of Saussure. A good example is Vladimir Prop's important structuralist work titled The Morphology of the Folktale. It was about folk tales, but again, very obviously the title shows that the theory is hugely inspired by linguistics. Prop collected and examined the basic structural elements of Russian folk tales, and he broke down these stories into morphemes, analyzable parts, if you like the morphemes of a language. And Prop identified 31 narrative units that comprised the structure of the stories. Narrative units are, for example, departure and return, quest, rescue, punishment, and so on and so on. Not all stories contain all of Prop's basic units, all 31 units, but they are essentially built on these units, or some of them, at least. And this example also shows very well another important part of structuralist thinking, that there is always a surface structure and a deep structure to anything that you would investigate. There are many, many different looking surface structures and a finite amount of deep structures behind them or under them. And a structuralist thinker would always be interested in the latter, because if you learn or gain this finite amount of knowledge, then you have the ability to know everything about whatever you investigate. If you know all of the deep structures, if you've learned or investigated all of the deep structures, you can generate and you can understand all of the surface structures. These are the same, there are the same rules behind every phenomenon. There is a structure behind every text, for example. Now, of course, when it comes to text and structure, you want to think of narratology, the science of stories and storytelling. It is deeply rooted in structuralism, and actually it is one of the most successful projects of structuralism. If you are interested in literary theory, it's nice to know, maybe even useful. So basically, it's important that through learning these finite amount of deep structures, you can actually, at the end of the day, have access to reality. If you cannot have access to reality altogether, that is only because there is just too much information, but if you had enough time, you would be able to learn everything. And that, in science, is a huge thing to claim. to have the ability at all to gain a complete objective knowledge about something. That's a huge thing to claim, and post-structuralism has a huge problem with this principle. Another problem, of course, is that practically it's just not true. Take the example of language. Language is a system. According to structuralism, we may be able to create an infinite amount of sentences, but there is always going to be a limited number of grammatical rules behind those sentences with which they operate. But you may remember that Saussure always talks about what he calls langue and not parole, which is language on the level of the individual or language use in practice. On that level, language becomes pretty messy. For example, particular people or groups of people always mean slightly, sometimes very different things by ostensibly the same word. Let's see an example again. The word that we will think about is the word dog. If you did your Introduction to English Literature and Culture seminar with me, this may be familiar. So, what do you have in mind when I say the word dog? Most European people have something like this in mind. North American people, on the other hand, usually think of something like this. Now, of course, Europeans think of a German Shepherd and Americans think of a Golden Retriever because these are the most popular dog breeds in the respective cultures, right? But on the level of the individual, it again can be even more difficult, or it can be yet again different. Let's say you have a dog. And let's say it looks nothing like a German Shepherd or a Golden Retriever. If I just say dog in general, you may think of your own dog. And of course, that's perfectly fine. That's how all of language works. The important thing is that however systematic language might seem, when it comes to meaning, it is also very, very unreliable. We can probably all agree that ambiguity and uncertainty are there in many, many words. Now, what Derrida claims is that they are in each and every sign, and actually that is basically the essence of a sign, or the essence of the way a sign operates. Now, there is something that we need to talk about before we get to actually reading Derrida, especially if you haven't read Derrida before. I wish someone told me these things before I first read Derrida. I'm not going to lie, it is difficult. And reading his text may be a bit frustrating exactly because it may seem like he's making it way more difficult than it actually is. When I first read it, I kind of had this thought in mind, like, okay, Derrida, I can tell you're trying to say something, but why won't you just say it? What? Just make your statement. What do you gain from putting your thoughts into this form? If you remember academic composition course, where we learn to write, but first and foremost read academic text, you learn a lot of structural things about academic text that can help you read them efficiently. Topic sentences, more or less linear internal structure within a paragraph and things like that. And sometimes I tell academic composition students that what we learn here or there helps very often. It helps with most texts, but not all of them. And Derrida's texts are among those exceptions. But why is he doing that? Is he doing that because he's so bad at writing? Of course not. He does it deliberately. It is because, again, he's not simply claiming something other than what structuralist thinkers did. He's not simply having a different opinion. He's not simply talking about new issues or ideas, but it is the way of thinking which is different. And this is what is reflected in the structure of the argumentation, and that's what makes it difficult. The very essence of deconstruction is that in nature, it is sort of like this evasive dance, as Paul Fry calls it, and in it, the thinker doesn't really settle for distinct positions. Like, this is where I stand, this is what I claim. If you do that, you restrict yourself and your argumentation in a way, which may or may not be a problem anyway, but if you are doing deconstructionist writing, it is a must that you do not make it look like you have a fixed position and you can convey fixed meanings, because deconstruction does not believe in that. Deconstruction is precisely the deconstruction of simple, straightforward, definite concepts. And that is why it may feel like Derrida is moving around in argument and not straightforwardly saying things, at least at first. Also, it may seem unclear what exactly he's talking about in general. The reason for that is that he's not differentiating between different kinds of texts, different genres, literary texts, legal texts, etc. He's talking about what he calls discourse that stands for all of these and more, actually. So this is what you need to sort of maybe mentally prepare yourself for. By saying this, I'm not trying to make it look like it's incomprehensible or simply not good in any way. I'm just trying to draw attention to this fundamental nature of the text that hopefully actually makes it easier to read and comprehend. And maybe that now that I talked so much about it, you will imagine that it's so difficult that when you actually get to reading it, you will realize that, oh, it's not that difficult. I expected worse. So structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences. Derrida begins by announcing that something has happened. He doesn't clarify what. He uses the words rupture and redoubling to refer to it, which, incidentally, when you think about it, have very different meanings. And then he also uses the word event for what happened. The term event would be best avoided though, because it implies a solid point, so it's just used for lack of a better term. So what is it? What happened? We will get there. Then Derrida starts to discuss the concept and the nature of structure as it was used in the humanities at the time. He does it with a special stress on the center that is imagined in the concept of the structure. Now, according to structuralism, as we know, with enough rigor and with enough work and investigation, we would be able to reveal or learn the truth. We know this will be a problem, and you might notice that it also goes pretty much against the theories of ideology among what we have already discussed. But let's see what Derrida has to say about it. So Derrida, you need to keep in mind that he's a philosopher. He builds a lot on the work of Heidegger, the author of Being and Time. So let's use a concept of being to illustrate such a structure with a center. In the Middle Ages, God was understood as this ultimate being. God existed before and above everything. And everything else existed in relation to God. There was not a lot of room for reordering this structure, this hierarchy, right? That's quite easy to see. Everything was ontologically fixed, and no signifier could just flow or float around. Everything referred back to God, and that's it. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, of course, but as for the nature of the structure, it was like this. And this idea of the center, of the transcendental signifier, if you like, this ultimate being, which is God in our example, it limits the free play of the structure, and that's the problem according to Derrida. On the other hand, as Derrida pointed out, the center belongs to the structure, and it is also outside of it. It's both inside and outside, which might sound strange at first if you haven't encountered this idea yet. But again, God is a good example to think of here. So the structure by nature cannot move, but the center can, and it does. And the history of the study of structure, according to Derrida, is the history of the study of this moving center. As he says it, the whole history of the concept of structure before the rupture I spoke of must be thought of as a series of substitutions of center for center as a linked chain of determinations of the center. But what does it mean and how does it work if we look at language, if we look at signs and signification? The presence of a thing had always been placed before a sign. It always had more weight than a sign, because signs are substitutions, so to say. When we don't have the thing in front of us, we need to speak of it to refer to it. If we always had everything we wanted to refer to around us, then we would only have to just point at it or something, whatever we would like to refer to. We wouldn't need to use language because we would have presence. So the signifier refers to a signified, right? This is where Levi-Strauss is first mentioned and criticized. Levi-Strauss wanted to use the concept of the sign to move beyond this problem of the sensible and the intelligible, which is a binary, which is, the favorite conceptual tool of structuralism. Now, the sign, Derrida says, cannot oppose the binary between the sensible and the intelligible because it just generates more binaries. If you remember, we know a sign only because we know that it is not something else. It's not another sign. Now, Derrida talks about, at this point, he talks about ethnology and anthropology because he talks about Levi-Strauss, and those are his fields. Derrida also talks about or refers to Saussure, not by name, but we've already discussed Saussure and semiotics, so even without such a clear reference, you probably know him when you see him. Now, carrying on deconstructing Levi-Strauss's text, and by the way, I said Derrida is criticizing Levi-Strauss, which is true. But don't imagine that Derrida is, ripping apart Levi-Strauss or something. No. In many respects, he stands on Levi-Strauss's shoulders, and also in this sense, deconstruction is not negating structuralism, it is stretching it. It's stretching it a lot, but not getting rid of it. So Levi-Strauss is an anthropologist, and of course he's interested in human culture, the opposite of which is nature. A phenomenon that belongs to one apparently cannot belong to the other. Whatever is universal is natural, and whatever is cultural, often technical, it's unnatural. But Levi-Strauss finds one thing that sort of works differently. He finds that incest is something that, as a rule, does not happen in nature. Incest prohibition is universal, it's natural, but it is also a cultural taboo. It is also a very important element of all human cultures. So it is, interestingly, both. It's both cultural and natural. And Levi-Strauss says that this is scandalous. It's supposed to be either this or that. Yet it's both. And Levi-Strauss asks, then does it represent a split between nature and culture? Because it's a part of both. And Derrida proposes the problem that follows from this very nicely. From the moment that incest prohibition can no longer be conceived within the nature-culture opposition, it can no longer be said that it is a scandalous fact, a nucleus of opacity within a network of transparent significations, which means there is a problem with the whole network, with the whole structure. It's probably not an exception, but it means that the whole system is a little bit different from what we thought it would be. Let's see some more of this. So Levi-Strauss is, of course, also interested in the relation of culture and nature. It is one of the most well-known binaries, culture versus nature. Again, whatever is universal is natural, and whatever is cultural is unnatural. Nature came first, and then came culture, right? Levi-Strauss also adds that we are nostalgic about nature. We don't have it anymore. We have culture. So we are nostalgic about nature. And according to Derrida, the very thing that we are nostalgic for is produced by our nostalgia. There is no nature unless you have culture. In the structuralist sense, at least. You don't have the concept of nature without the concept of culture. In this sense, culture brings nature, at least nature as we know it, or nature as we remember it, it brings nature into being. Actually, Levi-Strauss claims something very similar when he explains the binary of the raw and the cooked, like food, raw food and cooked food. Nobody could understand the notion of raw without the notion of cooked. So cooked, although the phenomenon in time came later, cooked has to come before the notion of raw, just like the notion of culture comes before that of nature, although the phenomenon came later. When we think of binaries, we sort of think of one as being causative of the other. And this is a very basic move of deconstruction, the declaration of the interdependency of things that we understand in binary terms, things we understand as opposites of each other. The next term and concept and action that Derrida is discussing is the bricolage. And the bricoleur, who, according to Levi-Strauss, is someone who uses the means at hand, so to say. That is, the instruments he finds at his disposition around him, those which are already there, which had not been especially conceived with an eye to the operation for which they are to be used, and to which one tries by trial and error to adopt them, not hesitating to change them whenever it appears necessary, or to try several of them at once, even if their form and their origin are heterogeneous, and so forth. The binary pair of the bricoleur is the engineer who creates things for specific purposes, instead of just, using whatever is around them. If you think of the workings of language, the way we use language, which one would you say? When you use language, are you a bricoleur or an engineer? Of course, you are the first. You are the bricoleur. You can only use whatever is already there in front of you or around you. You can't make up new words, you can't make up new rules, grammatical rules, because others wouldn't simply understand you. Now, this engineer, whom Levi-Strauss opposes to the bricoleur, should be the one, in the case of language, should be the one to construct the totality of language, syntax, lexicon, everything. In this sense, of course, the engineer is a myth. And since Levi-Strauss tells us elsewhere that bricolage is mythopoetic, the odds are that the engineer is a myth produced by the bricoleur. Again, one concept is the cause of the other, and it is again the one that seems to come later, that seems to be secondary, and it seems to cause the one that might appear to be the original at first, at least. Actually, the myth is a very good phenomenon here, as Derrida explains it, because a myth doesn't have an author, it doesn't have a creator, it doesn't have a source, and what else? Of course, a myth doesn't have a center in this sense. Derrida continues with the criticism of the traditional ideas of language. This is connected to what Derrida calls supplementarity. A supplement means actually two quite different things. On the one hand, it is something that completes something, and on the other hand, can be something that adds to something that is already complete, right? So do you need a supplement, or do you just need a supplement? The signifier is needed in place of the presence, as we know, that's easy. But for Derrida, there is always a superabundance of the signifier, something more, something extra, a supplement. Now we go back to Saussure for a second. Saussure made the sign a scientific object of by claiming that it is both arbitrary and differential. And in deconstruction, the sign is something that is always proliferating signification. A sign is never still, never independent in and of itself. It is, so to say, spilling over, always pointing towards other signs in a way that leaves what Derrida calls traces. There are no stable binaries in Derrida. So how is that possible? It is possible because signifier doesn't have a connection with the signified. It has connections with other signifiers. The point is not that if I say the word dog, you will each have something slightly different in your mind. The point is that it starts a chain of signifiers. Dog calls into your mind something that is related to, and that leads to something else, and that leads to something else, and that can potentially continue forever. That is the infinite chain of signifiers that you can slide on forever, according to Derrida. There is structure in that, all right, but that is probably quite visibly different from the way it was understood before. And that is what the last sentence of the essay points out. Towards the end of the essay, Derrida speaks about this contemporary anxiety. And just think of the context of this study. This is the 1960s. The aftermath of the Second World War can still be felt. The former colonies are becoming decolonized. There are the civil rights movements, etc. These are very anxious times all around the world. You need to see that. And in philosophical terms, there is no essential core meaning anymore that we could rely on. That sounds pretty worrying, right? But for Derrida, this is not exactly a negative thing. This is not exactly a negative scenario because it also means that there is room for any number of interpretations and readings. We can interpret any way we want because we are not restricted by tradition. There is no, there is an ontological anxiety instead of or in place of a fixed ontological position. But we are not left without any methods or modes of interpretation. And the very last sentence of the essay, let me read it. I employ these words, I admit, with a glance towards the business of childbearing, but also with a glance towards those who, in a company from which I do not exclude myself, turn their eyes away in the face of the as yet unnameable, which is proclaiming itself and which can do so, as is necessary whenever a birth is in the offing, only under the species of the non-species, in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity. Isn't it beautiful? This is how Derrida announces the birth of deconstruction. He calls it a monstrosity exactly because it doesn't fit previous ways of thinking, but actually that is, or that was, its potential at this certain time in history, and that is what made it work. For a long time, it was a very successful method. I wouldn't say that it's dominant now, but it definitely hasn't disappeared, and it hasn't been disproven. So that's about deconstruction and Derrida for now. I don't know how it feels if this was the first time you've set out to study Derrida. I tried to summarize it as briefly and concisely as possible. But let me know, and also definitely let me know if you have any questions. And until next time, thank you for your attention, and bye.